Adios, soldiers. I went to the grocery store today and I bought a incredibly expensive bag of grapes because I was like, oh, I haven't had grapes in so long and I need to buy some more fruit. So this will be the only fruit that I buy for myself this week. I got it home and every single one of those grapes was soft. There were 8 salvageable grapes in that entire bag. So I paid $12.99 for 8 grapes tonight. And if that's not a good metaphor for today's video, I honestly don't know what is. Welcome all to the Saturnalia special. It's the time of year where everyone's talking about love and romance, and I think I'm actually going to post this on Valentine's Day. Yeah, you can see this timestamp. No, it did not. But, happy Friday. I wanted to talk about Romantasy for a while now, and figured, hey, now's probably the best time. I will also be painting my nails in today's video, because I have some cute Valentine's Day plans, and I want to make sure my non-existent claws look good. I already pre-gamed, I have a base coat on. You can't see it. If you've been living under a rock, welcome to the dumpster fire that is publishing in 2024. Romantasy is the hottest new genre that is a portmanteau of romance and fantasy, aka books that have heavily romantic plots that also involve fantastical elements. What started as a fun little marketing SEO tool has transformed itself into a recognized genre. However, it is still in its baby stage, and that means that a lot of people have things to say about it, including myself. As somebody who is both chronically online in the bookish space and as somebody who works in book distribution and publishing, I've seen everything from the front-facing fandoms to the behind-the-scenes chaos that is the building of the Romantasy genre. And so I wanted to address some of my own thoughts in today's video. So without further ado, grab a drink, grab a snack, and buckle in as I give you the Valentine's Day Special 2024, a lukewarm defense of Romantasy. Alright, let's get started with these nails. Oh, I'm a bit sick if you can't tell, and I really heard it come out in my voice just then. Well, shit. Come on, man. There we go, okay. Oh, disaster averted. Now, a lot of my thoughts around Romantasy do come from like internalized misogyny and ideas about the romance genre as a whole, which I've done videos on before, talking about how, you know, women have less social capital, and so therefore anything that women like or women's spaces tend to get devalued, and romance is a perfect example of that. It is a genre written for women by women, and a lot of people put down romance readers because they think that these books don't hold anything of value. Plus, until more recently, romance novels were a more heterosexual space, so a lot of people thought that it was anti-feminist and just reiterating gender roles. Oh my god, that was a rough first coat. Maybe I shouldn't have done this while filming, but we're one hand in now. Now, I'm not going to be talking about YA books in this video because Romantasy so far has been decided as an adult category. However, I need to start with YA because of this weird crossover that we have going on. So as you can see, maybe you can't see. Oh, maybe you can't see because of my autofocus. Okay, there's a lot of YA on these shelves, okay? Trust me. Trust a stranger on the internet today. Now, even though I am 28 years old and, you know, have money and prospects, I still, to this day, love YA books because as YA is a umbrella term and it's usually written for a younger audience, this means that authors have a little bit more freedom in the boundaries of the genre. So you can be more creative and have higher concepts. You can kind of genre bend and genre blend. And because it's supposed to be for a younger audience, you have more accessible writing, it's gonna have a faster pace. Plus, when you're a teenager, hormones are running high, you're gonna have some really intense emotions, and that usually leads to some pretty fast, intense romances. But I find also, as I'm growing older, I want that same feeling, but I want it for my own age group. So I want that intense romance that I got from Clockwork Princess. You know, I want that high stakes, tension-filled energy of a heist from Six of Crows. But I want those plot lines in a way that pushes the limits in a way that YA can't because of its younger audience base. But I find when looking for the things that I want, you tend to get one or the other. You get romances that focus on building relationships and tension within the couple in a contemporary setting, or you get the existentialism of war and the consequences of magic. And it's like, yes, I want the clashing swords and the dragons and the elven warriors, but but I also want the two main characters to kiss. So when I heard that there was this new funky, fresh genre hopping on the scene called Romantasy, I was like, this is gonna be the genre for me, and unfortunately it hasn't been so far. I keep picking up these books that are labeled as Romantasy, and I'm always disappointed in them. And so after doing some soul searching and also talking to some of my friends, one of whom writes Romantasy, I think I've come to a realization as to why there is such a divide in the audience that reads that, and it all has to do with expectations. Romance fantasy and fantasy romance are not the same thing, because fantasy romance is a romance book that has a fantasy element, whereas romantic fantasy is a fantasy novel that has a romantic element. So I think really, when we talk about what romantasy is in today's wordage, verbiage, romantasy makes it sound like it's romantic fantasy, when really it should be fanomance. We'll workshop it. Fantasy readers and romance readers will go into a book expecting to have a different kind of reading experience, because fantasy novels and romance novels have a lot of things that are very important to the genre, but that are very opposite of one another. Depending on what type of reader you are, you won't like romantasy. For example, romance novels have a formula, and there's a certain amount of plot beats that a writer is expected to hit, like, you know, the initial meet cute or the third act breakup. Romance novels are typically in a contemporary setting, which means you have more pop culture references, you have more things that an audience can instantly connect with. You also have faster pacing and a specific focus on the two main characters getting together. Whereas in fantasy, like, yes, you still have the initial incident and the rising action and the climax and whatever, but there's a lot more room to play around with the type of fantasy. Is there magic? What kind of magic? Are there dragons? Are there elves? Are there both? How much rising action do you have? Are there one villain? Are there two villains? Does the main character even get a love interest? The pacing is a lot slower. The language that the characters are using is not contemporarily based. Problems the characters are going through are not typically something that the everyday woman would come across. For example, I'm reading a book right now where some characters have wandered into a magical fog that is obscuring this swamp of magical proportions and they might get ambushed. And that doesn't happen to me on an everyday basis. Maybe it happens to you, I don't know your life. And since many quote-unquote classic fantasy novels are written by men, think George R.R. Martin or Brandon Sanderson or Patrick Rothfuss, a lot of people, regardless of gender, tend to start with those titles, which means that you kind of go into the fantasy genre already having a male view, and a lot of high fantasy novels are quite misogynistic, which then further reinforces the devaluing of women and women's characters. And if we look at it from the other perspective, it's quite hard to build chemistry between people on page in a way that is realistic. And I'd say it's actually pretty difficult to write dialogue as a contemporary romance writer, because people know what other people sound like. If you're using slightly out-of-date slang or you're over-explaining something, people aren't gonna believe it, or they're not gonna like the book because, oh, that's so 10 years ago. Some magical elf warlock, he can talk about his feelings all day long because, I don't know, but I haven't met many, and maybe that's something that they do. New day, new canned beverage, same video, let's go. My nails dried, so look at all that incredible mediocrity. I had some issues with the sound of the second half of this video, and as I was watching it back, I just realized how choppy that this script sounded while I was trying to paint my nails at the same time. Apparently this is a single brain cell activity. Here we are, once again, in my sleeves to finish this video. So let's pick up where I left off. Romantasy, in the way that I think that lots of people think they want, is actually really hard to write, because the author both has to write a compelling fantasy story that is based on backstory and world building, and build a romantic relationship that's based on intimacy and trust, and both of these things separately take a lot of time. So by these standards, all romantasy books should be like this big, and instead a lot of them are like this big. And I think that is some disappointing expectations that a lot of us can relate to. Readers often feel like one gets developed more over the other, so either the fantasy gets neglected or the romance goes from 0 to suddenly kissing. So I want to reiterate, this is not an author issue. This is a marketing issue. Damn it, capitalism strikes again. It's not that these books are bad or they're not serving a niche market, it's just that the term romantasy has been misattributed. It's literally the blueberry milk nail trend, but for books. If you don't know about blueberry nails, Google them. Watch Jordan Teresa's video. Light blue nail polish has been around forever. No one was stopping people from painting their nails light blue. Companies still sold light blue polish, but suddenly one influencer is seen wearing light blue nails, and now we have 1001 Court of Thorns and Roses knockoffs. But you can always tell when a romantasy author is typically a romance author. I'd say a lot of readers who typically only read fantasy do not understand a modern romance voice. And it can be quite jarring to go from descriptions of the elf king Mithranduil swiped sweat from his brow and surveyed the lands of Midgard, where he then swiped the blood of his enemy dragon rider warriors off of his sleeve. To war we must go, he said. I'm a theater kid. It can be jarring going from that to a modern romance book where maybe the opening line is like, I can't believe he didn't follow you back on Instagram, your best friend said, taking a sip of her $8 smoothie. Romantasy is accessible. It's not scary to get into because you know that it's not going to be overly dense fantasy world building, but it's still going to have enough fantasy that it's recognizably not contemporary. But on the other hand, it's also going to have more romance than a typical high fantasy, classic fantasy written by a man is going to have without being a scary, fluffy pink Harlequin romance novel with Fabio shirtless on the cover, which again, misogyny, issues with Rebecca Yarros aside, I think this is why Fourth Wing did as well as it did, because it's a high fantasy secondary world that uses a modern voice. Like for me as a fantasy reader, it was very weird going from like war college, dragons, magic to, oh my god, he's like so hot, like sizzling, get you in trouble hot. I was like, oh, it's like qualified as a jump scare. But for a regular romance reader, they can be like, oh my god, he is so hot, and oh, there's dragons! And to name another juggernaut of the genre, issues with Sarah J. Maas aside, the reason that ACOTAR is so big is because it does something similar. A Court of Thorns and Roses is the perfect intersection between magic and accessibility. The world has fae courts and creatures and magic, but it also is not overly wordy. And though it's not entirely modern, like she doesn't use any modern slang, the cadence of her dialogue and of her conversations reads more contemporary. It's getting people who read romance into reading fantasy, and it's getting people who read fantasy into reading romance. And like, if romantasy itself has gotten you to read something new and take a step outside your comfort zone and discover a new favorite type of book, then like, that's great. But also, the word romantasy has very specific connotations. And when I break it down in my own head, it has to do with sex, because that's what romantasy is getting marketed as. It's the whole point of the book is to get the two characters together so that they can bone. A lot of romantasy books are just erotica, and I have no problem with that. If you want to read smut, read all the freaking smut you want, but also, like, call it like it is. I am a story girly through and through. If I come to a fantasy book, even if one that has romance in it, I want a plot line. I want character beats. I want story development. I do want the characters to kiss and maybe get down with their bad selves, but I also want to know why they're doing it. I want to build up, because I find a lot of romantasy books are labeled like that, but then it's just 200 pages of banging, Court of the Vampire Queen, which again is fine, and it must have to do with marketing, right? Because like erotica is still considered taboo to say, but I'm like, y'all are reading fairy porn. It's literally a joke on TikTok about reading fairy porn. Just say erotica. Like, what's the big deal? And it's this point in which I stumbled across these posts. I'm sorry I'm not on Threads. 2 threads by indie romance authors Karina Halle and Nisha Tuli. A fantasy book with romance subplot is literally just a fantasy book that happens to include a relationship. Millions of books have a relationship in them. That doesn't make them romantic or romance. This brings up an idea, to me at least, of genre hierarchy. For example, I was talking with my good friend and author AJ Vrana, author of The Hollow Gods. This is a contemporary fantasy, or like an urban fantasy, slightly paranormal-esque book that, yes, does have a relationship in it, and she says that this often gets shelved as romance because the main characters have sex and talk about their feelings sometimes, but like it's not meant to be a romance novel. And like romantasy is such an online term because in a bookstore, if you have a romance thriller fantasy novel, you can't shelve a physical book in a store in 3 different places, so you have to pick which genre it has the most of. Even though that you can have a book that has multiple genres or multiple different things happening to it, like romance is probably going to come out on top. On top, you say. Which then leads to readers going into a book with certain expectations and those expectations not getting met. And another great thread is actually on horror novels. Horror novels tend to have very average or even low ratings, even with really famous horror novels, because horror is subjective. Everybody has a different expectation as to what is scary. And like, for example, my girlfriend and I read a horror novel and I thought it was horrific and gross. And her review verbatim is, "There wasn't enough worms." This leads me back to yet another AJ Vrana quote. "Since 2020, women-centric fantasy has experienced a major shift that has resulted in more genre bending within the fantasy umbrella. However, this experimentation and fusion of genres has led to friction around marketing and reader reception. Now we're discussing whether these subgenres are legitimate categories or if we are simply making arbitrary distinctions." Now I think this also goes back to the idea of romance books being devalued and people putting down romance readers. People don't want to be told that a book that they like is bad. So in their own way, they're recontextualizing and like recategorizing and creating more subcategories so that you can go back and say, well, this isn't a bad fantasy book because it's not a fantasy book, it's a romantasy book. And just like horror spans such a large range of things, so too does fantasy. Like you could have a political fantasy like Jade City by Fonda Lee, which technically takes place in sort of our world, but also with like greenbone warriors who use jade for magic. And you could also have Deal with Yelf King by Elise Kova, which is a high secondary fantasy world that has like elves and vampires and otherworldly magic, but these still both technically count as fantasy. And not to say that like specific search terms or tags are a bad thing, because I love a niche book. So if a very specific tag of romantasy helps someone narrow down what they're actually looking for in a book, then like great, let's use them. But at the same time, I don't see anyone making political fantasy its own genre. What would political fantasy be? Politasy? Politanasy? We'll workshop it. And that is also where a lot of the friction and the tension lies, because it's like, do we really need to keep making more and more subgenres and tiny things and whatever? And of course, like, growth is good, and recontextualizing what we think of as certain things is good because that means we're like moving forward as a society or whatever. But are these distinctions actually important? Because to a degree, again, with marketing and like niches, like, yes, I would like to know if this book has more romance in it than this book, but I personally don't think that it needs to have its fully owned genre. I thought of a very good mirror for this, and that is new adult. New adult is a subgenre or category of romance where the main character is anywhere from 18 to 25-ish. And romance is such a large genre that people started labeling these younger protagonists as a new adult subgenre to, again, help people in that age range find a book that was right for them. And like, personally, I like new adult books because I can relate to characters that are 25 a lot more than I can to romance books that have a woman who's 40 with children. But just because a book has a 19-year-old protagonist doesn't necessarily make it new adult. I've seen young adult labeled books that have protagonists that are 18 or 19, and it works because of the content of the book, because of the language that's being used, and the amount of detail that the author puts into things like violence, mental illness, and sexuality. And new adult dives into those topics in a way that a 15-year-old might not understand fully or might not be able to realize or contextualize. As I was editing this, I also had a thought that it's very interesting that even though new adult was already kind of on the come up as a romance category, and publishing did kind of acknowledge it for a while, but like everybody was talking about it and it was kind of becoming its own thing, and there was discussions over whether it should get its own section in a bookstore. Books conglomerate did not make it a genre despite it making money and it being kind of like the next new thing, which makes me wonder why the industry now is so willing to make romantasy its own thing. And like, SJM did not invent fantasy romance, and if you think she did, then you need to go back and read the classics. I'm assuming it has to do with like a right place, right time, right situation type of smoothie, because no trend springs out of nowhere, right? And like, the demand for romance has been increasing for a number of years. Indie authors are becoming more respected, especially in the 2020s. Fantasy has really expanded its borders, so it must be like the market wanted something new. Just some thoughts, you know, just some capitalist hot girl thoughts. I also want to state that even though this video makes me sound like it, I do not hate books that are considered romantasy, okay? Like, I'm having a lot of fun, actually, getting into new authors and trying out a combination of tropes and world that, like, I'm not usually used to. It's just that, again, the term romantasy is false advertising because it means romantic fantasy, but it's really giving fantasy romance. So basically, I made this entire video out of spite over false advertising. I can't believe I made an entire video that boils down to manage your expectations. But really, just like new adult or blueberry milk nails, like, romantasy is, in my opinion, a trend, and I don't think it's going to stick around super long term. Like, it's making a lot of money right now using that word, but where do you see romantasy in 10 years, right? Like, I think it's just gonna get reabsorbed back into romance, because it's both too specific and too broad. Oh my god, romantasy is like a siphonophore. It exists within itself in like a colony that's also an organism, but as soon as you take the single organism away from the colony, it can survive on its own, but only because of certain reasons. Look up a video on siphonophores. I'm gonna leave the octopus lady down below. That incredibly niche neurodivergent interest aside, please leave down below your thoughts on romantasy. I want to hear all your thoughts. Do you like it? Do you not? Do you think it's redundant? What do you think it's gonna look like in 5-10 years? Do you write romantasy? What are your experiences with it? And of course, please feel free to leave your romantasy recommendations below, because I want to check them out. It is so much later than I expected to be filming. I'm so sleepy and my back hurts so bad. I'm 28 years old and falling apart at the seams. Because I'm taking a dance class right now that is kicking my entire ass. Billie Eilish is responsible for throwing my back out, and not in a spicy way. Oh yeah, and happy Valentine's Day. You know where I clicked like the video, you know where I clicked to subscribe. I hope you guys are all having a nice day or night wherever you are, and I will see you all next week. Bye!